Good morning, everyone. A warm welcome from the IFO Institute in Munich in Germany to our press conference, The Future of Energy Policy in Europe. My name is Harald Schulz. I am the spokesman for the IFO Institute, and before I used to work with Reuters and other organizations. Today we launch a new Econ Pulse study on energy policy in Europe. The title is What's Next? A nice play on words with James Watts, the Scotsman who improved the steam machine. Here at the IFO Institute, let me introduce you to Karen Pittel, who is leading our energy research and who is also professor at the University of Munich. Next is Julio Saavedra, Senior Economic Policy Advisor to several Gulf countries, particularly the Sultanate of Oman. In addition, he is a fellow at Oman's Royal Academy, and editor-at-large at CET and other institutions. Then we have some more of the very best energy experts in Europe. There is David Newbery, director of the Cambridge Energy Policy Research Group and Emeritus Professor of Applied Economics at the University of Cambridge, England, of course. Pedro Hilares, who is Professor of Industrial Engineering at the ICAI School of Engineering in Madrid and Director of the International Doctoral School of Comillas Pontifical Universitat in Spain. And we also have Frédéric Gonand, Professor of Economics at Paris Dauphine-PSL. He also used to be economic advisor to the French Minister of the Economy, who was a certain Christine Lagarde at that time. And bien sûr, he was educated at the École Nationale d'Administration. But last, not least, we have Georg Zachmann, a senior fellow at Bruegel, an independent economic think tank based in Brussels. We will now listen to a short introduction by Professor Karen Pittel, and then we'll come to your questions, as is the custom for press conferences. We have about 1 hour for the whole thing. Frau Pittel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And let me just add that all of the authors of the report are here today, except one who unfortunately could not make it, and that is Andreas Löschel from the Ruhr University in Bochum, and he's also known as the head of the expert group on the monitoring of the Energiewende. So with that said, let me just give you a short introduction into our report, just teasing what we have done and where we are coming from. So basically the motivation, as should be, I guess, pretty clear, has been Russia's invasion of Ukraine as a wake-up call really for Europe and its dependency on the metals and also on the specifically energy front. And of course, then also the associated threats that poses for the European economy. The aim of the report is really to examine some of the lessons learned, what went well, what did not went well, but also, of course, then trying to look ahead on what's needed in the future to basically, on the one hand, strengthen resilience, but also decarbonize while still remaining competitive. Now, of course, following the crisis, there was really a myriad of measures taken in the different countries, most of them focusing either on securing supply of especially gas, but then also on lessening the burden on households and on industry specifically. And if you look at the number of measures that have been taken in the EU, that amounts to more than 400, most of them actually on a national level. So coordination between the different European countries was pretty limited during that time. At the same time, the measures that were taken succeeded in diversifying the imports of natural gas and in lowering the dependency on natural gas. But in some contexts, that came at quite the heavy burden to the economies and specifically on households and industry. And that, of course, then also being one explanation why there was such a large focus on this alleviating of the burden and on basically also price dampening measures. Now, at the same time, there was some focus on reducing energy demand, but most of it was actually driven by increases in prices. So there was a demand reduction on the household side, also on the industry side, sometimes going along with reduced output, with or basically producing somewhere else in the world and importing, but also by using, for example, oil and gas instead of coal. Now, there was not much really long-term planning behind this energy demand reduction, which is, of course, something that is of utmost importance if you want to actually assure for the resilience of the future European energy system. Now, with respect to of course, me as a climate economist, I'm very interested in that. The question, how much oil, coal, and gas did we burn? We actually saw a pretty continuous downward trend over the last years before the crisis hit in the use of the different fossil energy sources. But of course, then while the gas usage went down pretty distinctively, we saw an uptick in the use of coal again. And the question is, of course, how do we achieve net zero? How do we actually get from what we see at the moment and also this kind of reversal of a trend, at least temporarily, back to somewhere where we are using only decarbonized sources? And of course, also, how are we going to do that? Because what that will require is quite the massive amounts of certain resources, of certain metals. So it's estimated that we will need 6.5 billion tons in 2050 of these so-called green metals, including but not exclusively rare earths. So starting from that, basically the analysis of the way it was before the crisis and the way it was during the crisis, what we came to was the way forward. Now we can, of course, ask, why did we publish, or why do we publish the report only now? But that is then also due to the fact that, of course, you need a certain distance from a crisis to get a better idea of what worked, what did not work. Now, on the way forward, of course, like I said, the most important thing is the switch to more decarbonized energy, or let's say less carbon intensive energy, of which most of which will probably come from intermittent energy generation sources. And of course, while these are by now in many areas competitive with respect to, or compared to, fossil energy generation, what we will need increasingly, and that's also been the discussion in the EU for a while now, is a smart design of policies that not only provides the incentives to invest in renewable energy sources, but also influence the locational choice and the price expectations that people, households, and the economy actually have with respect to the future. And if you talk to industry leaders today, they, of course, complain about the price level that's still observable, but they also very much stress the expectations for the next 5, 10, 15 years. So how do we actually get a stabilization here? And like I said, of course, another area way forward is really the question of, do we have the resources required to actually get that transformation? What can we actually do to improve upon that part of energy security? And then, of course, another part of the way forward is really preparing for potential future crises. Now, building on that, we identified a number of fields in which we are giving recommendations. And let me just click very fast through these. So we started with the lessons learned from the energy crisis. And that was, of course, on the one hand, strengthening energy security and lessening strategic dependency in the future, also increasing flexibility in Europe. But also, I think one important lesson was really avoiding distortionary policies and using the power of markets for the transformation in the long run. Now, there might be necessary to actually use price dampening mechanisms sometimes as a short-term palliative, but when it's done, it should really be temporary, and there should be a good balance between households and firms. Now, at the same time, we need, of course, to adjust the existing and build new infrastructure, hydrogen, natural gas, power grids, just a few examples. We need the fiscal space to actually support this. And two more things that we basically urge the European Commission and the policy leaders is, on the one hand, to establish a strategic foresight office to actually be prepared for the next crisis, and not just thinking that by preparing for the last crisis, we're actually going to be prepared for the next, but identify strategic potential weaknesses far in advance. And of course, also communicate the measures that you need, and also the potential costs and required changes in behavior, honestly, on the one hand, of course, to the people, the citizens, but also to the economy. Then we have energy and infrastructure, where we focus on strengthening locational signals for renewable installations and the grid. So basically also considering what is, not only where is the wind, but also where are the expected customers, what is smart with respect to hydrogen, and also where could be potential network constraints. We have policy coordination, where there is still need for policy coordination across the European countries. We need basically unified policies here in order to avoid strategic usage of these instruments also for subsidizing industry, and potentially, of course, then creating even a larger rift between the European countries. Then we have strengthening resilience, and strengthening resilience is, of course, especially also in the sense that we actually know what is happening at each point in time and what we can expect for with respect to the future. So we need to expand our knowledge on available data on energy storage, on flows, on value chains, prices, vulnerability of consumers, and so on. And if we don't know these types of risks associated with them, it is very difficult to actually prepare for potential future crisis. And when we prepare basically adequately with respect to these crises, we can also avoid to basically sink undue amounts of capital into the preparation of a crisis that might not be really that likely for the future, and might also show us that whatever we have done potentially also with respect to the last crisis might be too much, or potentially also too little so far. Then we have the metals and raw materials. And of course, we have a lot going on in that policy field already. I mean, I'm just mentioning the Critical Raw Materials Act here. But what we do need is still that these policies are being made, or the goals basically that are specified are being made more concrete, and actually also from rather abstract acts broken down towards specific policies. And then finally, the last two, industrial decarbonization. So we need, of course, the support for investment on the one hand in the decarbonized processes itself, so in machinery, etc., but then also creating markets for these green products in a circular economy. And that, of course, has to be done while still avoiding carbon leakage and securing the industrial competitiveness, where there is still room for improvement, as the CBAM is, of course, only targeting specific goods. It's only targeting imports, and here we see especially a lot of potential for the future development also of climate clubs. And this is really the final thing I wanted to add, because most of the discussions is actually on the one hand households, and on the other hand big companies. What we also need is much more consideration of small and medium enterprises and industry, in order also for them to be able to especially secure contracts with respect to energy supply that protects them against price volatility, and therefore against or gives them a better basis to actually plan ahead and plan their decarbonization individually. And with that, I will close, and we are, of course, very much looking forward to questions from your side.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. We are now ready. All of our experts, not only Karen Pittel, are now ready for your questions. Please raise your hand via Zoom, it's going to be like some sort of yellow hand that'll appear on my screen. So please go ahead. Anybody, any questions? It's been so wonderful, this presentation, that there's no question. I can't believe that.
I mean, just to add, the report is, of course, online since about an hour now. And you can also take a look at more detail. That was very abstract.
Yeah, it's about 60 pages long, or 66, I think, with all the parts added in the end. Is there no questions? I can't believe it.
The first question is always the most difficult. I know.
Sure. Break the ice.
Well, just for people to think about their first question, I may thank you, Karen, for this presentation. One of the points that we expand on is on metals. And this, I would not say it's new in a report for public decision makers, but you know, Russia is a prominent producer of platinum, of nickel, and of other metals. Now, this crisis can help us improving our policies as far as metals are concerned. Europe is heavily dependent on metals, and this is why we inserted some developments in this report about these issues, because we are convinced that in the future, problems will come back through that door, and it would be good to, you know, to benefit from this crisis, as to say, in order to be ready to face future crises on the prices of metals and the possibilities to face crisis on this side.
Could I just ask you a question then? I'll be the first. What does green metals actually mean? Now, that's a new word for me, and it's in your report. Tell me more about it.
Indeed. Well, a few decades ago, the number of metals that industries were using were not so numerous. I would say there were basically 12 of them. With the development of green technologies, for instance, in the wind turbines or in the photovoltaic industry, other metals have been increasingly used, and also in batteries. So, for instance, lithium, of course, but also what is called the rare earth. They are not so rare, actually, but the production is concentrated in China. So there are 15 metals of that kind. They are called, for the ones who made chemistry studies, these are the lanthanides. So these are metals that are produced in relatively small quantities. To give you an order of magnitude, copper, the annual world production of copper is around 22 million tons. The total of rare earth production is around 150,000 tons per year. So as you can see, these are smaller amounts, but they are very much necessary for many industrial processes, and not only green energy technologies. You can find rare earth in hard disk, in some application in the industrial sector. So the number of metals that the industry have been using over the last 40 years has really increased quite a lot. There are around 60 of them right now. So these raises problems of supply and security of supply. I hope this addresses your question.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much. So it's more metals that are used for green purposes and not metals that are green in the production line or something like that. Okay.
And perhaps also let me add to what I said. I think one of the most important backgrounds on the one hand was, of course, this looking at how the crisis was dealt with, what kind of things could have been better and what could have been worse. But I think also the timing of the report is really us stressing that there is the need for future cooperation in the energy market, and not only in the energy market, of course, but to reach the climate goals of the EU and to decarbonize energy, that will be crucial. And so this is also kind of a little bit strategically placed before the European elections come about, and putting the focus more on we than on individual countries, because at least that's what I am getting from different countries, that there is also a strong push I experience as a strong push to actually emphasize that every country is allowed to determine their own energy mix, and that the policy on the Brussels floor, let's put it like that, should be quite restrictive with respect to how it intervenes ultimately in the national energy market. And that is, of course, can make the transformation to a decarbonized economy, and also kind of a fair transformation in the sense that the needs of every European country are addressed simultaneously, much more can actually endanger that.
Thank you very much. I'm still waiting for your questions now. This is pretty unusual, I must say, that journalists are
not working, or
Herr Welter, what about you? We need questions here. Otherwise, you know, our experts are going to explain more and more without being asked questions. That's possible. Okay. Sabina Rosset, answer, niente. Okay.
That's weird.
Maybe somebody from our experts would like to add something. I mean, you've been talking about cooperation. Isn't that a piecemeal thing going on actually now? Because from the outside, you get the impression that every country in Europe does its own energy policy, and they don't give a heck about what the neighbors do. Isn't that the right impression that I'm getting, or is there something else that's going on?
I mean, I could answer, but perhaps let me go to Georg, as he is in Brussels and probably has the best overview of what happens there.
Right.
Yeah, thanks a lot. Also for organizing that. I think you're right. I mean, the challenge will remain that member states have strong interest to keep energy policy close to themselves, and we are essentially, in my view, at a crossroads moment where member states have to choose whether they go through the energy transition by conducting policies for investments purely nationally, so with a focus on building their optimal grid internally, building their optimal power plant park, or whether we go for a system in which the buildup of the European system, which is we are ahead of a massive wave of investments here. So essentially doubling the electricity system investments, the annual electricity system investments for the rest of the decade. So whether this investment is going to be in a national system logic that will lead to duplication, that will lead to a somewhat inefficient system, but that will, of course, ensure more control of the member states over what is being done there, or whether we accept that the systems essentially converge into a system that is jointly optimized, which, however, will require that some control is kind of seized by member states. To put it very concretely, we have currently national energy and climate plans by the individual governments that line out what they intend to do. And those national energy and climate plans are not coordinated across borders. So if Germany writes up a national energy and climate plan, there is a small kind of consultation around, but this is not worth much in terms of real coordination. If Germany sets up a power plant strategy, this power plant strategy is internally coordinated and organized in Germany, but it's not at all consulted with the neighbors. And if France decides to essentially change its nuclear plans and build another 15 gigawatt of nuclear reactors, it has not done a European consultation or discussion on that. Will that lead to a hugely inefficient system? I think there's limits to the inefficiency that arise from that, but the inefficiency will be substantial. So I would argue that it's easily 10–20% of the investment cost that will be wasted on a system that is not well coordinated across borders. And given that resources are so scarce, I would wonder whether we can really afford that. So in that sense, highly subscribe, of course, to our report's recommendation that leaving more to joint markets and enforcing more coordination across borders could help us to speed up the transition, get it much cheaper, and also to reduce emissions on the way, because if the wind blows in one country, you can then reduce gas-fired generation in the neighboring countries.
Thank you very much. That was for a quarter of a second. There was a yellow hand that was appearing on my screen. Patrick Welter, there you are. Please ask your question. We will open your mic.
Okay, hello, this is Patrick Welter, Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. Do you hear me?
We can hear you like double. There's a sort of an echo.
Wait a moment, please. If you have another question, take that one.
No, I'm
Is
sorry.
it better?
Please go ahead now.
Is it better? The
Yes.
voice?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. Let me ask one very specific question. I haven't had the chance to go through all 60 pages of your report, so I'm not quite sure if you have answered this question, even if you raise it. As you know, there's a huge debate about technology openness in Germany, if there should be some kind of guidelines which energy to use or not, or if there should be some kind of open market, just setting some kind of CO2 taxes or restrictions. So what is your point of view in that regard? Especially do you see, is there really a chance for Europe to get into some kind of hydrogen economy, where you might even could imagine some hydrogen-driven ICE cars on the roads as Toyota is developing right now? Do you see a chance for that, or is this just some kind of future dream, or just a dream at all? Thank you so much.
I can thank you, Patrick. I can quickly address that answer from the industrial side. As far as the steel making industry is concerned, it has announced over the last, I'd say, 3 years that it was going to retrofit the blast furnaces that used coke with blast furnaces that are going to use electricity and hydrogen. And this is really clearly a game changer. I think that 5 years ago, I wrote a report to the French Energy Authority. And one of the points was to say that, well, for the hydrogen sector to develop, you need to have a significant demand, or to have a significant customer on the demand side. It was not clear at that time, and at that time the CO2 price in Europe was around 20 euros per ton. It was not clear at that time that such a demand existed. 4 years now, 4 years after that, it's reasonably clear that to see that the steel industry is going to produce what is called green steel. This is to answer Harald's point. You have green metals, but you have also green steel. So in that case, a green steel, it's not steel that is green, of course, it's steel that is produced through greener methods, and in that case, with methods that emit almost zero CO2. So is there a light of hope on that point? Well, today I would say yes, because of that. This is the fruit, so as to say, of the rise, mainly it's the fruit of the rise of prices of CO2 permits in Europe, because nowadays, I didn't check this morning, but there are, I suppose, around 80 euros per ton, which is 4 times as much as 4 years ago. And with the reform of the CO2 market that was voted by the European Union in December 2022, I think there is reasonable probability that the price of CO2 permits will remain high. So the answer is yes.
Thank you very much. There is still that yellow hand. Does that mean that you want to ask another question, Patrick Welter?
No. So.
No,
I mean,
okay.
I could also add a little bit to that.
Yes, please.
I mean, with respect to the hydrogen economy, I completely agree with Frédéric, but that doesn't necessarily mean that everything that could be done with hydrogen is actually going to be done with hydrogen. So in the transport sector, especially with individual cars, I would expect that there's actually less expensive options. That doesn't mean that there could be a niche market. We already have niche markets for many things where you would say, okay, cost-wise, that is not necessarily advisable to use a certain technology. On the other hand, it's still used. So it could be a niche product, but at least the studies that I know, they are focusing very much, or they are forecasting very much, that most of the hydrogen will actually go towards the industrial sector, perhaps some in the more electricity, heating, etc. But the bulk is going to be industrial use. And the question is, of course, how can we be sure that that will work, that we will be competitive? I mean, there's definitely ways we can assure that it's not going to happen. And much of the policies, or much of the ideas that had been communicated on the EU level, also national levels, they just take very long to actually be implemented. I mean, IPCEI, for example, takes about 2 years to get approved. That is, on the one hand, perhaps you can see it's not that long, but 2 years in a firm, it's not that long from project approval point of view. On the other hand, if you look at firms, their decision processes usually are much faster, and these delays can actually hold up a lot. So I'm a little skeptical with respect to whether we will be fast enough to get the necessary policies in place, whether it's EU hydrogen auctions, whether it is the contracts in the Klimaschutzverträge in Germany, etc. It just takes all very long, and that is a development that needs to be fast. Technology openness. I'm very much in favor for technology openness, as are many economists. But on the other hand, you can, of course, also have to see that for some of the technologies, you need considerable investment in infrastructure. So basically building up infrastructure potentially for all technologies available, and then in the end discovering, of course, which one was the winner might also lead to huge sunk costs. So I think that is a process that has to be cautiously designed, let's put it like that. And that should, there I agree completely with you, should be driven by CO2 prices, enhanced by additional, for example, innovation market and innovation policies that also then cover the market entry and scaling up.
Thank you very much. Anybody else who wants to add something to that? I'm still waiting for the next question. I see new people arriving here in this group. Still don't see. Maybe I can ask a question to David Newbery, because thinking about Britain, you were on the way out. Do you think you will be on the way in on energy anytime soon, especially when it comes to the maybe new government next year?
Well, I hope so. But I would point out that we're still linked very strongly electrically to Europe. We, I think, exported during the crisis to help the French nuclear phase or decrease. And our plans still suggest that we will be building many more interconnectors. At the moment, we're most concerned with making sure that we use those interconnectors well, so that typically we have a lot of wind in Scotland and sun in the southwest. We need to be able to export the wind to Norway while we import nuclear power from France. So we need the prices to guide the way we trade. But the other thing I would suggest is that we do have a wonderful opportunity in that the cost of renewables is now very competitive against fossil fuels, especially with the high carbon price. And it's not government finance, it's primarily people investing in long-term bonds and investing, so the costs are spread out over time. So the hit to the consumers is not quite as dramatic as the headline numbers of how much it would cost to get to 2050 might suggest. So I think the markets will integrate Europe and the markets are guiding us towards renewables.
Regardless of the political situation. Okay, good. any more questions? I have here Sabina Rosset from ANSA or Joanna from LUSA. Chloé Jardine, I'm not sure if that's French or English. Don't get any questions. Oh, Georg Zachmann wants to ask a question. That's good.
Let me maybe raise one point from the report that is a bit controversial in Germany and might trigger some discussion. So what we strongly advocate, and I think also discuss on a couple of pages in the paper, is the question of locational pricing. So the idea here that we have different electricity prices in different parts of the country. David has provided a nice overview in the paper on the situation in the UK, on how that is being used to better get the location of power plants and consumption in the country in order to reduce also the need for transmission and run this transmission system more optimally. And Germany is the country that is in the center of the European electricity market. I think Germany has 10 other countries being connected to its electricity system. And we see a lot of relatively perverse effects with if the price in Leipzig, so at the power exchange, is relatively low because of a lot of wind. Then what happens is that in South Germany, sometimes gas-fired power plants are started in order to export electricity to France and to Austria, which is a massive waste of money because in the end, consumers in Germany are paying for this redispatch cost, and the redispatch costs have reached many billion euros. And not only for the case of German consumers paying for the redispatch costs, but also for the question of increasing the amount of electricity that can flow across borders inside the European Union. Getting rid of this single price zone in Germany would be a very low-hanging fruit from an investment perspective. So it would require relatively little investments, and it would bring a lot in terms of improving the dispatch and also the investment signals in the European electricity market. So here, moving that forward is, of course, a strong political question inside Germany because of the distributional effects. But given the big challenge that we have ahead, it seems to be a no-brainer, at least to the economists.
Sometimes what economists want is not what politicians want, nor people in the country. We've seen that a lot. If there's no question, I'm still wondering why there is no question. Can I then ask Pedro Linares? Spain and I think Portugal too felt somehow cut off from the rest of Europe through this barrier of mountains. Do you think, or maybe the barrier of mountains is the French government, I don't know. Do you see any chances in the future that these things will change? That is, that the southwestern part of Europe will be more integrated, like that island in the North Sea, which is also far away?
I guess if I had to bet, I wouldn't. As you correctly said, it's not only the geography, it's also the politics. And every time you build a new interconnector, there are winners and losers. And even within Spain. So people tend to think that it's the French that are against having more cheap renewable electricity coming in from Iberia. But I mean, the same renewable producers in Spain are interested in the interconnection to be small so that prices will be higher. So this is something that needs to be considered carefully. And given all the different positions that you have here and the complexity of building new interconnectors, which is, of course, very significant, I wouldn't bet of having a significant amount in the next 10 years. Now, of course, that might change, and then of course you can also, there's now this new move that instead of exporting electricity, some people see Iberia as an hydrogen exporter, which is just a transformation of renewable electricity. And some of the people even go beyond and say that what we should be doing is exporting electricity-intensive products. And there is this drive of bringing electricity-intensive industry to Iberia. So as you see, there are several flavors that you could consider here. And of course, all of them are quite difficult to materialize.
Okay, thank you. Still waiting for questions. Anybody? Oh, Julio Saavedra, your mic is closed, but if you want to ask something, I see your hand. You want to say something? Just open your mic. Yeah. Well, it looks like you're still mute to me.
Yeah.
Oh,
yes, now
okay.
you go. There you go.
Yeah, I wanted to add something about a foresight office that we proposed in the report. Because of when Russia invaded Ukraine, we were caught by surprise, even though there had been some signs for many years already that something might happen. So in order to avoid this, we proposed setting up an office that is tasked with looking forward and anticipate any crisis that might come. And we're not talking only about energy, also about cyber attacks or about any other geopolitical upheavals. And there are two pretty good examples around the world. One of them is in Singapore, where they have something called exactly that, a foresight office, populated with bright young people trying to anticipate what might happen in any area that might affect Singapore. The other example that I find very, very useful for Europe is Taiwan. Taiwan had been affected years before by SARS very badly. So they decided not to be caught unaware anymore. And they set up an office that was just tasked with looking around the world at anything that might affect, in terms of health, the island of Taiwan. And they were the first in the world because they were prepared. They were keeping an eye on things to find out that COVID could be transmitted from human to human. And they released that information, which was not acted upon because of China objections, Taiwan not being recognized as part of the WHO. But the idea of having an office that looks at what is happening in terms of health or economy or geopolitics or energy helps to prepare a crisis response. And by being prepared, you might not even have to use the tools that are prepared. So this is one of the things that doesn't cost much money, and we shouldn't be caught unprepared again, as we were in 2022 when Russia invaded Ukraine.
It kind of also adds
Thank
to
you.
I think the observation that we all have made in post-corona, and which is to be expected also after the current crisis, is that being in the crisis, everybody talks about how can we be more secure, more safe in the long run. And a year or two after the crisis, that is basically more or less forgotten. So what we need is really a process, and such an office can actually contribute to that, that deals with the question, how much do we actually want to invest in basically in our security in different areas? It can be health, it can be energy, etc. Because those are investments that might never actually, or that might be at a scale which you would usually not invest in, just to have this buffer, which costs you. If the crisis is not hitting, then it might see as if that money was wasted. But if it's hitting, then it's of course well invested. And I think we don't have really the necessary discussion about the level of preparedness that we want to have, and then the amount of money that we want actually to invest in such a process, especially not given the time of tight budgets, and more discussion about where we can cut than where we can invest in such a process.
That looks like a typical insurance problem, isn't it? I mean,
it is an assurance problem.
Who pays for it if it's, who pays for the firefighter if there's no fire?
If there's an insurance market for it, you don't have the market necessarily, especially for risks where the risks are largely unknown with respect to their quantity with respect to when and if they may hit. So where there could be markets, they usually arise, but for some of these aspects, especially if it's low probability, you don't have the markets, especially on a national scale.
Right. I'm still waiting for journalists' questions. This is a very surprising press conference. Niels
I've never had something
Sorels.
like that, so that's interesting.
Niels Sorels, yes, please open your mic and ask your question.
Okay, sorry, I was trying to come up with an intelligent question. The bit about having to repurpose existing gas pipelines to make them usable for hydrogen, I was curious, how big an undertaking is that going to be? I mean, in Germany, they're talking about it's going to be about 60% will be based on existing networks. Like is that standard? I mean, is that 60% like common, or is it significantly more or less in other countries? And if it is significantly more, I'm just curious about, I mean, right now you hear about there's labor costs are ridiculous. There's a shortage of laborers. I mean, how are we going to do all this work if, there's not a workforce available or, for an affordable workforce, maybe better said.
Thank you. Who would like to answer that question? Change of gas structure, Pedro, maybe?
I mean, we've been looking at this, at the hydrogen backbone in Europe. And as you correctly say, the points of the hydrogen pipelines in Europe is to try to use as much as possible the old gas pipelines, because it's basically much cheaper to upgrade an existing gas pipeline to allow it to transport hydrogen than to build new ones. So that makes the cost acceptable, right? So so that could be an option. However, I think there are two important questions that we need to answer first, which is something that was already raised at the beginning of the conversation, which is what is the role that hydrogen is going to play and at what time. And here, of course, the thing is hydrogen is quite expensive. And contrary to what is going on in the US, here it doesn't seem that there's going to be a strong policy to make the cost lower. So before building the backbone, we should look carefully at what is the role that hydrogen is going to play, and whether there's a big discussion, at least in academic circles, about what is the best way to bring hydrogen into Europe, if any. Is it better to produce it in hydrogen valleys in a very decentralized way? Is it better to bring it from the south of Europe, which is presumably more competitive? Is it going to be coming as blue hydrogen from the North Sea? Is it going to be coming from Chile or from other places? I think there are many questions that need to be answered before thinking about the backbone. And of course, this is a discussion that should be had right now, or at least in the coming years, because as you correctly say, this building will take a lot of time and a lot of effort, and we should plan it very carefully.
Thank you very much. Does that answer your question, or is there more to it, Niels?
I'm good.
Oh, thank you.
Perhaps adding, nevertheless, I mean, the 60%, as I understand it, also depends on technological parameters, and of course also whether you need actually the gas pipelines or the hydrogen pipelines in the same places as the gas pipelines, which in many cases might be the case, and other cases potentially not, depending also on the export, import, or within country generation where it's actually happening. So I don't think you can take the number 60% and just say it's the same for all countries, because it depends on technological, but also on other issues. Yeah, I mean, perhaps just to add to that, and of course, costs will then also depend on how much you actually have to invest technologically in the new ones, but also in how do you repurpose the old ones. I mean, for Germany, I think it's estimated that we will spend about 20 billion on the so-called hydrogen core net, Wasserstoffkernnetz. But that is, of course, then also dependent on, like you said, the on the one hand, with respect to the timescale, availability of labor, but also cost of labor and cost of everything else as well. But this is, of course, the labor availability, etc., is not just a question for the hydrogen grid. I mean, it's basically one of the big challenges that are behind the obvious challenges in the energy or in the transformation of the system. I mean, we always talk about specific instruments, etc., but of course there are huge fundamental aspects. I mean, we always talk about the how fast will it be possible to get the permission for certain things. So the administrative, the bureaucracy, and then that is one part, and the labor availability, and to actually get all these transformation done in the essence. That's of course another huge challenge that we're facing, and that has to be solved by the government somehow, not just with respect to the hydrogen question.
Thank you very much. I think, Pedro, Spain, Portugal are building now a pipeline of hydrogen to France. Is that true? Around these mountains, through the sea?
Well, no,
because France
actually,
didn't want natural gas to come into.
Well, that was a if I can be a bit politically incorrect, that was a political decision, basically. Nobody knows exactly what is going to go through that pipeline. In fact, there is a big discussion now because the Spanish government says that pipeline is designed to bring renewable hydrogen into Europe, and the French are arguing that it could carry nuclear hydrogen into Spain. So, and of course the cost is going to be huge because it's going to go through the ocean, down through the ocean. So yeah, that's one of the examples of policy of infrastructures driven not by sound economics or sound perspective, but rather by policy whims. And we'll see where it goes.
Yeah, I agree. The project is very much in its infancy.
Please tell us more about it, Frédéric, because I think you know much more about it than we do.
Well,
I mean, if the direction of the pipeline isn't even clear.
Well, no. Well, the name of the project is BAR-MAR, which stands for Barcelona
Marseille,
to Marseille, but which is a nice play of words. But apart from that, I discussed, I think 2 months ago, with a high representative of the French transport operator, and well, we do not know exactly where the pipe is going to go through because the Mediterranean Sea is very deep at that point. And well, we'll see whether this pipeline will emerge, if I may say, and that's not sure. Another problem, that's a problem because, yeah, you know, the pipelines between France and Spain, unless I'm mistaken, they represent a capacity of 7 billion cubic meters per year, which is really small, and this, yeah, it's a bottleneck. It's definitely a bottleneck, and this is why the LNG that came from the US during the Russian crisis to Europe was regasified in the UK rather than in Spain, and that's suboptimal from an economic point of view. And I agree with Pedro. This has a lot to do with politics and shenanigans and that kind of considerations. From an economic point of view, it would make sense to have a bigger connection between France and Spain on the gas market.
And I thought it was natural gas that was in a project between Spain, Portugal, and Germany through I think Scholz had sort of aligned everybody, and then the French government did something volte-face. This is a weird project.
Yeah.
What has happened? Yeah. Okay.
Well, that I don't know on the details on that.
Yeah.
But, it's complex. Yeah.
Okay. I have another journalist asking a question. Joanna, please. Open your mic.
Hello, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes, wonderful.
Hello,
Thank you.
here Joana Souza from the Portuguese news agency Lusa. Sorry in advance for my voice, I'm a bit sick. So if you don't mind, back to politics, you mentioned the words cooperation within the European Union, and also that countries should think more from a we perspective rather than an individual one. I wonder, with the growth of the populism, extreme right parties in Europe, and we have the recent example of Portugal with the party Chega, with these protective economies, how could this be possible, in your opinion, this setup?
Yeah, who wants to answer that?
I mean, I think that this is the question exactly why we wrote that report, because it's worrying all of us. I mean, of course, better information about the potential repercussions if you actually try to do everything by yourself, like Georg also pointed out, is one way to go. If it's communicated honestly and also then transported via, for example, the media. But of course, on the other hand, there is limits to that, and we all know that. So how to actually get a reversal of that trend? I'm not a political scientist, so I find that very hard to answer that question. But of course, it not only impacts the design of energy policy, but to some extent also the goal of decarbonizing the economy, especially if the reality of climate change, for example, is sometimes even called into question. Let's put it mildly.
Okay, Georg Zachmann would like to add something.
Yes, so I mean, the challenge that many member states now see themselves confronted with is that there is a substantial backlog in terms of investments on the electricity system. So a lot of power plants, renewables, networks need to be invested into in the next years. And if you put the sums up against the state budgets, you will see it will not be possible to finance those power sector investments easily out of fiscal funds. So the implicit hope is a bit that if you want to get these investments done, you better rely on European markets, because that allows you to get access to cheaper financing means and to essentially push some of the costs to future consumers and not necessarily put them directly into the state budget or on current consumers. So here, the idea would be that you can be as populist as you want, but at the end of the day, you have to deliver these investments, and that will be pretty difficult if you do not manage to rely on a European regulatory framework that enables you to essentially get private investments into the sector at decent capital cost, and hoping to put a lot of this money on not the next 3 to 4 years of consumer tariffs, but on consumer tariffs stretched out over 20 years. So that would be my argument to say why a European market still has hope, even in the times of populist national governments. We have seen several national investment projects fail that were looking to do things just out of the fiscal coffers, because it is getting increasingly tense. I mean, just the new budget for the German government has been released today. And the cuts are huge, and it will be extremely difficult to find any billions, let alone tens of billions, for investing into the power system.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay,
Thank you.
obrigado. Then I'm just wondering if there's another journalist asking a question, because I have one from a doctoral student from the IFO Institute who somehow sneaked into our press conference. But maybe we could take that question now that all the others have been exhausted. Okay, go ahead,
Hello.
please.
Thank you. So I found it so interesting, so I also wanted to ask my question. Thank you. So I remember reading in a report that achieving net zero emission targets wouldn't be possible without nuclear power. And as we would need base load power in the system, because solar and wind are intermittent. And I would like to ask your thoughts about this. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, there you go, Karen Pittel.
It's a
Maybe
good question. Yeah,
that's
it's a good question. I mean,
dommage que Frédéric soit plus là.
I mean, in the end, if it's a pure question on what's technologically possible, then at least studies show that we can do without nuclear power. So we can have, for example, other base load, I mean, not necessarily base load, but base load capable power plants that could run without CO2 emissions. So that would be possible, and you of course have a lot of storage capacities as well. The question is, would it make sense to some extent in cost optimal, cost efficient power mix? And there you get to very different results depending on which type of costs you actually also count in for nuclear power. Nuclear power is not that cheap. I think that is something we can all agree on, especially if it's a newly built power plant. And it's not necessarily what you want to combine intermittent power sources with. If you really want it to ramp up, to ramp down, to ramp up, to ramp down all the time. Now, base load power plants that run through all the time will not necessarily be needed in the future, but you will need power plants that are actually controllable in the sense that they can be ramped up and down if the renewables are not producing. Now, in most of the forecasts that you see about the future of the European energy system, you will always see nuclear power in there, which is in actually something that is cost efficient, like I said, with respect to the costs that are assumed for these power plants, and some are just taking into account the goals that have been set by different governments and thereby integrated into the development of the future energy system. But I'm sure there's other opinions on that.
Pedro, you just rose your hand, and now it's down again.
Yeah, well, I was thinking that Karen was answering pretty well to the question, so I got my hand down. But anyway, I think what is important to understand is that this nuclear costs compared to renewables plus storage seem not to be competitive in most countries. But that depends very much, and that's an important point. It depends very much on what is the availability of storage. For example, hydro storage may be easier to handle. Other types of seasonal storage may be much more difficult to achieve. For example, if you don't have other seasonal storage devices, you may need to invest in hydrogen pumping, which is quite expensive. So this depends very much on the configuration of the system, on the availability of the different resources. And I do see some countries probably considering investing in nuclear because there's no other option for them to provide this seasonal base load, call it wherever you want, system. When we carry out simulations for Spain, for example, we find that we don't actually need nuclear. We have enough storage and renewables to deal with it. But if I think, for example, of some Eastern European countries with other limited resources, then, well, I wouldn't be surprised if there is a certain role for nuclear there. So it's very system specific here.
And also, I mean, we are at the moment in a different project, basically writing a report, or have commissioned a report, let's put it like that, on the question, is there room for baseload capable in the sense of basically that you can ramp them up and down, generation capacity in the future? And the answer is, it depends very much on the cost. And of course, if you look, for example, for coal plus, and that's the catch, CCS, or gas and CCS. I mean, those are, of course, options you could combine with intermittent energy sources. But they, on the one hand, of course, with respect to acceptability in the society, there's very little acceptance for them, and they're pretty expensive. So there's, like I said, it's the question of, is it technologically possible and is it economic efficient? And with respect to economic efficient, I mean, I agree with Pedro, and then, but the question of, is it possible to do it other? Yes, you can, but it might be, in case you need other storage, might become really expensive. And the question is also whether you can convince your population that that is a good way to go.
Thank you very much. It's 11:06 on my clock here. I think we just slightly past our 1 hour. So I'd like to thank you all, one and all, for participating in this morning, our distinguished experts plus the journalist who attended. I wish you all now a wonderful morning. The full report, 66 pages, is published now on our website and everywhere disseminated in the world, so that the good word, the word of the Lord, can be spread out in the world. And I hope that everybody has a happy reading and a happy publishing and a good writing and maybe broadcasting about what we've done today. Thank you very much and have a wonderful day. Thank you. Bye-bye.